I am Pastor Stephanie Haskins, and I'm with Ron Johnson and Sandy Lembree, members of our church. And I want to welcome you to Niantic Community Church, where no matter who you are and no matter where you are on your life's journey, you're welcome here. And I've asked them to talk about masculinity and resilience. I literally looked up the definition of resilience, and both definitions were revealing to me. The first definition of resilience is the capacity to recover, sometimes quickly, from difficulties. Makes sense. And then the second definition I think is more interesting. Resilience is the ability of an object to spring back into shape. So it has to do with elasticity. So that being said, I think there's something about, as we're talking about resilience and talking about gender roles that are helpful or less helpful, that there is a sense in which we are moving towards more true versions of ourselves. And I'm looking forward to having this conversation. I've asked Ron and Sandy to reflect on masculinity in their own lives. And I also wanted to connect this larger conversation. There's a lot of people having conversations now about anti-racism work and about masculinity and toxic masculinity and healthy masculinity. So there are larger conversations that are happening, but I'm pleased to know they're happening in a church environment. So how has the idea of masculinity shaped your life, for better and for worse?
I'm Sandy Lembree, and masculinity has really shaped me in two phases of my life. The first phase was my more early life. I've grown up in the South, and I also grew up with a family of boys. I got a brother, a dad, and my mom was really the more passive one. We were brought up to be man. We were brought up to be strong, tough. We were competitive. Growing up in the South, there's some bullying. Boys will be boys, and a man really shows no weakness, shows no emotion. Those were kind of the subconscious guidance that I had gotten as a youth. There was good and bad to that. Some of the good is because of that, I feel like I can handle any situation. Pretty much since my emotions stay even keel, my logic really dictates, and I can really come through anything. But I think with that upbringing, there was a lot more negatives to it. I put a lot of pressure on myself to be perfect. And, that's not a very happy existence. In fact, I kind of took myself away from a lot of people, or I, was more of a loner back then. It also impacted a lot of my relationships, including, I would say, first and foremost with myself. I never understood what my passions were. And because of that, I never really understood what my interests were. And, I really didn't treat myself well. If I had known those interests, or had been more, instead of trying to be tough and masculine, who knows where I would be today. Second half of my life, later, next thing you know, I'm married. I have children. This all happens at the same time. I'm part of Niantic Community Church. Suddenly at work, I have people depending on me and working for me. I find slowly as I'm learning through the church that a lot of the masculinity personalities that I had are what a lot of other people have, and they impact the people I care about in life. My little Mary, my little daughter, she's growing up. It breaks my heart that she's smarter than me in so many ways. Same thing with Amelia, same thing with Nori. It broke my heart that it's harder for her to succeed in the business world than it would be for me. I also had different role models. Ron Johnson right there is a good role model for me. But then, through the church, I had Pastor John, Russ Kirby. My brother-in-law, Kason, is a great role model. And my son, Joaquin. All of these people are caring, loving. They care about others. They care about the big picture and impacts on society. They love people as individuals, their strengths and weaknesses, the mistakes they make. And that is just such a good way to be and a good way to see. It's not that strong. It's a caring mentality. And, I seeing that, I began to love myself because, I have all these differences. And, you put less pressure on yourself and you get, there's a bigger perspective, and I'm happier by having a different, maybe a more healthy masculinity. Joaquin will watch this eventually, and I've just been so happy watching him grow up. He's somebody, he was adopted. We knew at age 4 or 5 that, he was going to grow up a gay child, gay man now. And he celebrated his differences. He could sing, he could dance, he can act. He's so smart. And I learned a lot from watching him grow up. And it's just been an amazing masculine journey for me.
The person that you are and the understanding of your masculinity, I think has a large part is due to the people around you. You are made by the people around you, especially when you're young. I grew up in the 50s and 60s. So that was a period of time where role models for women and men were very rigid. I also grew up in southeastern New Mexico, which was an oil town and where football was king. So you talk about a lot of examples of toxic masculinity. I had a lot there. But I also struggled with my masculinity. I was short and I was small. And, I had a complex about that. And maybe so being a man, or not at that time, a young man, that was a problem for me. But I had a cloud of witnesses around me, which was my family. And it started with my great grandmother. This is on my father's side, who was a pioneer woman. She lived from 1843 to 1920. And she was raising a family during the 1860s when southeastern New Mexico was a cattle drive area where they were driving cattle to market. So she, her witness, and the way that she raised her children, which was my father and my aunts, that had a direct bearing on how my parents raised me. And we grew up on a dairy farm. So everybody did everything. There was no male or female, total roles. We were involved in the entire working of that dairy farm. And my sister did the same things that my brother and I did. I had 2 aunts that never had children, and we were their children, and they helped raise us to appreciate both the strengths of women and men. So I had very strong women in my family and role models in my family. So I dealt with toxic masculinity, but my father and my mother were role models to me. And my father was the parent that cried. He was the parent that hugged us. And my mother was the one that was tough as nails. So that in some way defined me. I was not raised as a macho male man in the 1950s and 60s. I was raised to respect and appreciate both women and men. And that was because of my family. And then when we joined the church over these past 40 years, some of my best friends and role models have been women in the church who have been leaders in the church and been the rock of our church for all these years. So that has defined also who I see myself in my masculinity role. Last and certainly not least are the women in my life that are my spouse and my children that help me keep centered and help me keep humble as a man to be a husband and a father. So I appreciate those people in my lives that have shaped who I am.
Well, that kind of brings me to the next question. I'm interested in two things. One is what you two would say to other men who want to move toward healthier masculinity. And let's focus it with the men that you know. What do you think men are struggling with the most right now?
I would, in my advice to other men, I would ask them what you think a good man should be, and what example would you want your kids to follow? If you have your kids follow something, you're going to want them to follow, being more caring and loving, veering more towards, in my opinion, the healthier approach. You treat others how you want to be treated, accepting of all individuality, differences, and just, basically loving everybody. You get to know yourself better, and it really makes you happier. You understand your passions. So I see this a lot at work. They feel a sense that they have to hold their families together and everything. And okay, they play a part in that, but it's really a team effort with everybody in the family. And I'm seeing people come into work that are dealing with loneliness and depression, and because of COVID, they're isolated at home, either alone or with their families, and they feel maybe a burden because of like the historical traditional masculinity values, that they have to be the strong one. Lean on your family. Talk to everybody. Make it a team on what everybody should be doing. That is what I see as probably the biggest thing of my coworkers and the people who work for me, is a level of depression.
The people that I respect the most, and this is both men and women, are the people that are authentic, that are true, and are really the person that you're looking at. And then maybe men more than women do not show you their authentic self. And I think people really are drawn to and relate with people when, they're showing their authentic self and not putting up a face that, is not really, who they are. What would you say to men who want to move toward a more healthy masculinity? And the first is, it takes a real man to admit that they can't do something or they can't do everything. Do what is right all the time. Don't judge yourself by what others think about you and their expectations of how you should act. Don't be afraid to cry in public. Don't be afraid to admit that you're wrong. Surround yourself with women who will help keep you centered. and what it means to be a man. And then understanding that, be a positive role model to other men. Support organizations that help and support women of domestic violence. And this is one that I hear a lot about. Call your doctor or call a doctor and schedule a physical. And I think a lot of men, do not deal with health issues in an open and positive way that they should. That was the last one, but maybe that should be the first one. Take care of yourself.
Ron, I'm glad you said that, because one of the earlier things of being masculine, which maybe on the more toxic side, you got to be strong, you got to be rugged or whatever. But there is a slight lesson learned there, and it's kind of what you said. You do need to keep yourself healthy. You do need to exercise. You do need to eat right, and it's these kind of things that help your mindset and keep you in a good frame of mind, so you can be a good role model and explore more healthier masculinity.
Right.
So, yeah.
Or another one is graciously accept help when you need it. Because we all need help.
So the word that comes to mind as we're talking about this is vulnerability. Like, being your authentic self means that you're willing to show yourself well enough that other people may or may not accept it. There's a kind of rigidity and a brittleness to toxic masculinity that just allows for no weakness, no humanness, or not enough humanity. And it ends up boxing in men and putting them in just these narrow confines. And it's so sad. But I wanted to ask how your faith has played a role in this journey toward healthier masculinity. So if you have response to that, or maybe you're going to be looking for more opportunities in the future.
So a lot of my responses here are how we treat everybody. Okay, it's not just how you treat another man or women in your life, it's how you treat everybody. So that's kind of prefacing my answers to this. And my first one is that we're all precious creations of God, and we should treat everybody that we meet every day, understanding that. Practice the golden rule every day. Do unto others as you would have others do unto you. Remember that some of the strongest examples of God's love in Scripture are women. Mary Magdalene, Ruth and Naomi, Esther, Miriam, both of my favorite passages in the Bible. Micah 6:8, but I prefer to use Eugene Peterson's The Message, because it says it a little differently, and I think appropriate for our conversation. But he's already made it plain how to live, what to do, what God is looking for in men and women. It's quite simple. Do what is fair and just to your neighbor. Be compassionate and loyal in your love, and don't take yourself too seriously. Take God seriously. In Galatians 3:28, there is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither slave nor free, there is neither male nor female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. So if you practice all of those with everybody you meet, I think that you're a man. Or you're practicing, healthy masculinity?
For myself, I feel like God's kind of put me on this journey to give me a certain wisdom on this. He's put it so that, the early half of my life was really a more toxic, so I can compare it to the later half of my life, which has really been a more veering towards a healthier masculinity. This church has been huge for me. It's an open, affirming, reconciling church, and my whole time here, either my family, Nori, or my kids, we've all been exploring what equality for all means. And I've actually been thinking about how masculinity has kind of, taken away from the equality for all approach, subtly in some ways and not so subtly in other ways. I think God's journey has given me not just perspective, but wisdom as to really be able to start to identify what's a healthier masculinity, how it can make people happier and become better role models. And I believe through this, my faith is telling me to, sit in things like this or, help other men come to terms with masculinity in public settings or in private settings. God and my faith are telling me to do this.
Amen.
Yes.
Well, this has been a really rich conversation, and I really think we could talk about this for 3 hours. Healthier masculinity is a journey that individual people take, and I thank you for taking that journey. And it's also a conversation that I hope more and more, especially men, will have. But I think it affects everyone. And I think we've seen some examples nationally in the last year or 3 or 4 or 5 years of examples of masculinity that are not on the healthy side. But I've been hearing from a lot of men, even men my own age, who want to live into a different reality, but don't always have the mentors and the role models for that journey. So I thank both of you for playing your part. If you could meet one person from history, and I'm excluding Jesus from this, who would it be?
I would like to meet Dietrich Bonhoeffer. I would like to meet a person. I guess that had the courage to go back to Germany from the United States, knowing that he was going to his death. I'd like to meet somebody that has that amount of courage. And I don't know if people know the story about that, but he came to the United States from Germany to go to seminary, or finish seminary, something like that. And he knew that once when he got here that he had to go back. Friends had talked him into coming and getting out of Germany because they were fearful for his death. And he knew that he could not stay here. He had to go back and stand up to the evil and the hate that was there. And he died in the concentration camp because of that.
I think since we're talking about healthy masculinity, and that I've talked about some of my maybe non-healthy masculine traits in the past that I never really got to know myself. I suppress a lot of feelings that I would like to sit with somebody famous that is really talented, expresses his art, expresses his personality. And I could learn just from that conversation. How have you lived? How have you grown up? My brain is telling me Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, somebody like that. just wonderful, super talented in music, super expressive in personality. And I feel I could learn. I haven't shared this earlier in the conversation, but I probably haven't cried since I was 12 years old or something like that. So I've talked about going from different phases of masculinity, from younger to more healthy now, but I still feel like I have more growth to do, more resilience along a learning journey to do. And I'll be doing that journey until the day I die. So I'm looking forward. This conversation has actually been great. Saying, wow, yeah, I need to really think about this. And so thank you.
You're a lot younger than me, so you got a lot more to.
Well, Ron, if I can say too, there's no better man to learn how to cry from than you. I mean that as a complete and utter compliment, because that's one of the things I really love about you. And Sandy, we're on a journey. I think we're on a journey. If I had to answer my own question, actually, that's along the lines of, I think, healthier masculinity, especially for his time, is Abraham Lincoln. I would have loved to hear him speak and to give like the Gettysburg Address. I think his writing is some of the best American writing that we've ever had. And I think his soul was great and magnanimous, and I'm in awe of him. So he's mid 19th century and all of that, but I think he was a recent-ish example of healthier masculinity.
A large part of that was because he was a person of faith. That's where a lot of that came from. Yep.
And he was, this connects to a previous strand of this conversation too. He was acquainted with suffering and deeply acquainted with how he felt. If you read his writing, I mean, he was probably clinically depressed pretty much most of his life. But in those days, they didn't have the psychological concept for it, really. But he talked a lot about his melancholy. And he had a very kind of ambivalent relationship with it. But one thing that it led to was this deep capacity for empathy. He was so well acquainted with suffering himself that he had this deep well of empathy for other people and for their suffering. And
I think
go ahead.
Joe Biden, I think, has the same capacity because he suffered so much that people comment on that he has so much compassion in him. Yep.
That's a good example of that's a good recent example of, I think, a man who by life circumstance has been softened by the losses that he has endured, and instead of kind of like going into himself, which I think was part of his initial grief when that accident happened with his wife and daughter, but he kind of moved out of that and sort of talk about resilience. He's like again and again throughout his life sprung back, elasticated, kind of sprung back with some kind of resilience. And that's a beautiful model of an older man too.
Yeah. Winston Churchill is a great example of resilience and what he faced, because there was the very real thing that the Nazis were going to take Great Britain, but he was a huge part of not letting that happen.
I wondered if you two would be willing to be open if someone in the future should watch this and want to talk about masculinity or their journey toward healthier masculinity, if you two would be open to a conversation about that.
Of course.
Sure. Absolutely.
Well, I'm going to say thank you. And once again, thank you for joining me and Sandy and Ron for this conversation on resilience. It has made me more resilient just listening to these two guys. And we'll catch you next time on our resilience video series.